So on today's episode of the Provoke podcast, we have LaMisha Hill, who is a PhD. She is Director of Multicultural Affairs at the Office of Diversity and Outreach at University of San Francisco. She's also an assistant adjunct professor in the OBGYN and Reproductive Services Department. Welcome to the show, LaMisha.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, and so LaMisha, as you and I have talked about previously, we are doing, a lot on D&I in the PR industry, not just on the back of the Black Lives Movement. This is something that we've been covering for a long time. Obviously, we've amplified it recently. And I was thinking about two areas that I had covered recently. I had done a series on mental health in the PR industry because it's a high stress work environment.
Mm-hmm.
And you add on top of that being a person of color in this business that I think the latest stat is like 89% white, and some of the added feelings of isolation and tokenism that can contribute. So there's a lot we're going to cover on today's episode. We're going to talk about the mental health component, and then we're also going to talk about the D&I role and how the industry can make that role most effective.
Yeah.
So, and LaMisha, I want to give people context around how I know you. My neighbor is Bedford Palmer, who you have a podcast with, or had a podcast with. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Dr. Bedford Palmer and I created a podcast. He founded this podcast called Naming It. And together we spent a couple years in this virtual awesome medium that continues to be a really important space, talking about the intersections of Blackness, psychology, and social justice. And so the podcast was really started in 2014, really on the heels of the original kind of movement for Black lives. And because of all the national discourse, it really took its own shape. So originally we were like, what are we going to talk about? He and I can talk all day, but what are we going to do with this space? And because of our attention and our wanting to kind of center in that way, it was just an opportunity to give it that direction. But within the podcast, we have great conversations around intersectionality and really just this phrase of naming it as being an important opportunity to call in and call out the different sort of invisible elephants that are in many, many rooms and many, many spaces, and how it's important to give voice to those things and to center on voices that are oftentimes not heard or left on the margins.
Yeah, so I'll include a link to that podcast, and some folks that want to revisit some of those episodes. They are as relevant as ever right now. So you mentioned it started in 2014 on the back of the kind of the start of the Black Lives Movement. And LaMisha, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that evolution from 2013 to 2020 and what's changed in your opinion, because obviously this is not a new movement.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the listeners that may not know, Black Lives Matter was founded by three amazing Black women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. And they formed this organization after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the murder of Trayvon Martin. And, at that time, and then following in that moment, there were so many other really visible and powerful and really tragic losses of life. And the opportunity to proudly affirm that Black Lives Matter was met with so much resistance in 2014. And if we just get a chance to kind of juxtapose this very cyclical, I kind of think about it as a spiral staircase, right? We come around these moments again and again. And what my hope is that is different about this moment and this 2020 movement for Black lives is that we can unequivocally center in on Black lives in a way that we couldn't in 2014, right? In 2014, there was this debate around all lives matter and why was there a need to center in on Black lives? And so if we examine and look a little bit more closely that the experiences that have been happening historically, although folks really want to be ahistorical, we don't have to go that far back in time for folks that don't want to go all the way back to, 1619 and that whole thing, but check out the 1619 Project if you want that historical reference. We don't have to go that far back, but you do need to understand those foundations because they still show up today. So it is really critical. But in terms of really recognizing that the experiences that are affecting at the intersections of anti-Black racism, police violence, and other forms of marginalization and subjugation happen across many, many different spaces and have real impact on people's lives, their livelihood, and their access to breath and air and freedom. And so in that sort of comparative way, here we find ourselves in 2020, and I do hope that people understand the importance of centering in on Black lives, really in the spirit of targeted universalism. And even if you juxtapose that right alongside COVID-19, we know everyone showed up to COVID-19 in this like we're all in this together moment. But we have stopped talking about the disparate infection and death rates that are being had on communities of color, and particularly Black communities and Latinx communities and Native American communities as well. So it is important to kind of have that targeted perspective when there is a community moment.
So a lot there that I wanted to touch on. One is, you've mentioned that what was different this time is people are willing to say Black Lives Matter in a way that they weren't in 2014. What do you think finally made us hit that tipping point? Like one of the things, I've observed is brands and companies are saying Black Lives Matter, and they weren't saying that in 2014. They weren't saying that even in 2016. What changed? Or even thinking about 2018 and when we had the Charlottesville white supremacy marches, right? And there was a lot of talk about zero tolerance for hate, standing up for hate, but what's different this time is I think the language, and I'm curious as to what do you think shifted?
That's really hard to say. I wish people in industries who changed gears and made a change of pace and were not able to be in that moment could actually, and leaders in those spaces could really come forward and say, why now? What is different? Because for many folks, it hasn't been different. We've just been waiting for people to come on board. And I think that is also part of the process of how long it takes for people to have an honest reckoning with what is reality and what is real.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that with all of those things, and thank you for adding in Charlottesville and everything in combination, these are not isolated incidents, and nor is the disparities that are impacting Black communities across different spaces, whether it's in education, whether it's in employment, right? We are here in the Bay Area, so whether it is in representation in many different industries, it is a collective problem. Right. And it's going to require a collective solution. So it's beautiful to see the murals happening, in DC and New York City, and for people to recognizing actually that writing letters on the street is a mural, right? That is art, and it's not only art, but it's art activism. So
then I also want to touch on something else that you talked about sort of the having a more targeted approach, because in the past and even now, when I have conversations with people in the PR industry, sometimes it's a conversation about people of color. Sometimes it's a conversation about Black employees. Sometimes it's Black and brown, and I don't know who that includes and excludes. I mean, how do we need to think about the language that we use in this moment, in this situation? Is it underrepresented groups? And there doesn't seem to be a consensus around that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I want to start first giving honor and recognition to Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who really developed and has been championing the term intersectionality. And so one part, I want to say that Black lives are intersectional. And so when we anchor and center in on Black lives, it is not at the exemption or the exclusion of LGBT, people who are undocumented. There are plenty of intersectional Afro-Latinos out there in the world, but there is an importance to recognize that there's something very unique that happens at the intersection of two marginalized identities. And that's what Dr. Crenshaw refers to intersectionality, when not just in the spirit of both and, having multiple identities, but two marginalized identities. So there's something unique that happens in that moment. I'm also going to bring in another one of my favorite thought leaders, Professor John A. Powell from the Haas Institute of a Fair and Inclusive Society, who really developed a lot of language and a lot of pieces around this concept of targeted universalism. And the example that Professor Powell really always goes back to, and I think it's a really helpful one, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And if we think about the presence of different things in our environments, whether it is curb cuts or handholds, if anyone's ever going to go back on public transportation, right? So when the curb meets the street and there is a yellow placard, no, that is not there to give you traction on a rainy day. That was built for somebody to be able to access the built environment in such a way, yet everybody uses the curb. Everybody benefits. And so when we can actually advocate for targeted interventions and targeted strategies for our most marginalized community members to really create equity, right? If we want to recognize and achieve equity, we have to recognize first that everyone is not positioned in the same way in our environments, in our spaces, whether that's professionally, whether that's in your organizations, whether that's in health, whether that's in education, et cetera, et cetera. So first part is honoring and recognizing that that folks, because of different barriers to entry and different experiences, that everyone's not in the same place. And so the needs and the resources need to be tailored to actually be able to achieve that level of equity in the outcome, right? So we can't stand at the outcome, we can't stand at the end and say, well, how come there isn't, why is everybody not, here, with me standing here at this, invisible finish line? And partly it's because they didn't start from the same place. So I really think that that's important to recognize and really advocate that when we actually create equity, everybody benefits. So we don't have to get into this zero-sum game conversation. And I would say that many industries and many organizations have engaged in work from this perspective of inclusion. And I could go on a little bit of a tangent and a rant. So let me know if you had another question before I.
Well, actually, I think that's treating it like a zero-sum game is something that's worth thinking about, especially for organizations and to protect people from backlash, right? This idea of, we actually put out our own metrics as a media company around, targets that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to at our events when we have judging and things like that. And it was tongue in cheek, but I did get a few messages on the back of that from white men saying, I guess I'm never going to get to be a judge again, or something like that. And then treating this like a zero-sum game, that if we're elevating certain voices, it's going to mean that folks are going to lose out. So do you have any thoughts on how organizations can handle and deal with the fact that that it is treated this way, and how can we present it and make it clear that it doesn't have to be?
Yeah, I think that we actually need to unpack what are these terms. What is diversity? What is inclusion? What is equity? What is belonging, right? And so just to start with inclusion, because I think that that's the one that gets, confused the most, right? Inclusion is a demonstration, particularly in organizations when there's an opportunity for everybody, whether it's in your workforce or your team, to really have an opportunity to bring their best selves, to participate fully, to be engaged fully, and to have some agency in the decision-making process, and to be included and have a seat at the table, right? And so if we want to achieve any of our missions, whether it is something as wonderful as a scholarship or a promotion of an event, or elevating, that next generation, and having judges in that example that you just gave us, Artie, it's an opportunity to say, hey, we need to actually have that those voices in that way. What inclusion gets, I think, confused with is everybody. Right. So if we understand that inclusion is actually making sure that people have a seat at the table to fully participate, inclusion, I think, gets interpreted intellectually. I think about it just like a diversity umbrella, right? And we pop open the umbrella and we want to make sure that we have everyone in that conversation. And while that there may be points in times where I think that that's valuable and really, really important, that actually isn't the definition of inclusion,
Yep.
right? So I think we get a little bit lost when we come with these packages, right, that are distributed and talked about. And that it gets back to the conversation that you just kind of made a point around the terminology. And are we talking about people of color, or now there's another trending term, Black Indigenous POC, so BIPOC, right? So what are we really talking about, and why are we doing it in that way? And I think that partly it's the history of the pushback that people have received when they have tried to advocate for themselves, right? To say, well, what about this group and that group and this group and that group? And all that is very true. But that we are not actually competing for resources, I don't think, right? If we really think about that effectively. And there is not a zero-sum game, right? So we can actually have targeted approaches that create inclusive practices that can drive equity in policy and in action in such a way that inclusion is thought about not in just the umbrella of DEI, but that is really thought about in a little bit more strategic and intentional way.
It almost seems like because people are so unclear around what language to use, which groups to target, that it contributes to this fear, right, of even having the conversation, right? I mean, I remember just as the 2020, the most recent Black Lives Movement was getting a lot of momentum, I found some threads on Twitter mostly white folks that were basically saying, I'm afraid, like I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. I'm afraid of being tone deaf, or I'm afraid of using an outdated term. And I mean, how can we have these conversations that are uncomfortable so in a way that people don't feel like, okay, well, I'm going to use the wrong term. Do we say African American? Do we say Black? Like, what's the right? Like, yeah.
All right, that's a two-parter. I so appreciate you bringing that in. Number one, we need to stop saying that talking about DEI or race is hard.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that it actually reinforces something in our nervous systems, right? So there is a bidirectional relationship between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And so if you are primed with a thought of something being hard, it is going to activate something differently, even if it's the same level of elevation, right? When we get activated, right? When you were introducing me, I was activated. Probably when you started the podcast out, you were probably activated, right? But we know that we have the ability to move through that, right? And to say, wow, I'm excited in this moment. And that's also another piece. What do you call that activation? Do you say that it's hard, right? And how does that impact our behaviors? And what I think that we see is this moving away, right, is because either in action or in silence. Moving away from the conversation is because we have reinforced this narrative cognitively, but also neurologically, that this is hard, right? And so we have conditioned our bodies, right, when we get activated around this subject matter, whether it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, or specifically race, particularly in our Western American context, that people learn and teach themselves to stop, right? And so then now this is reinforced, that I've been activated, and my response is that I stop and I don't proceed. In any other way, if you are going to give a presentation at work, you get activated, absolutely. You're nervous, you're anxious, and you proceed, right? So I think that's one part, is that we need to stop calling it hard, because it reinforces something in our bodies and in our nervous systems. Secondly, and that pairs right into, I think, the work of Robin DiAngelo and white fragility, is that fragility gets reinforced in a whole number of problematic ways. Whether it is from maintaining the status quo, of maintaining this sense of this need of safety and comfort in such a way that I think is just really, really problematic. So, and the third part is, well, then how do we do it, right? If I am activated, and if I do think that it's hard, I think one part is that we got to do the work, right? You work through hard things all the time. And I think that there are things that are way harder than talking about equity and talking about race, right? for one right now, like solving, the problem of COVID-19, that is
Right.
hard.
Mm-hmm.
That is legitimately hard. Having conversations and affirming people's identity in the world, that should not be hard. Affirming someone's humanity, that should not be hard, right? So let's get real about what's difficult and what shouldn't be difficult.
Wow. I mean, I think you just said the headline for this podcast, which is we need to stop saying that calling D&I hard. Like, I think that's just such a game changer, right? In terms of people's thinking and mindsets around approaching this issue. It's like we've stigmatized it so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can go into more work. And it's so funny. Like last night, I was actually this morning writing a little piece about this because it has been something that I have been ringing the bell on. There are some other perspectives that go into that, which is also a concept around stereotype threat.
Mm.
And so the threat, I think, is real, and the activation is real. And Dr. Claude Steele has done, a lot of his body of work as a social psychologist on stereotype threat, which is in essence like this experience that anyone can have when there is an aspect of their identity that is the target of a stereotype, either positive or negative, right? Depending on the context, when it gets activated, it actually takes up cognitive space in such a way that it can impact performance. And they did a particular research study around the construct of the white racist, right? And so when people, an experiment with students, and I can give you a link on it, but in essence, the task was to organize a group of chairs in a room. And the sort of control part was, you're going to talk about something benign like sports, white students and Black identified students. You're going to talk about sports. Can you please organize the chairs? And the white students put the chairs in a circle, right, to talk about sports, and chairs went close together. When they were prompted, and you're going to talk about race, right? In the same experiment or in a parallel experiment, the chairs went further apart. So how did the researchers understand why do people move away? And this is a critical piece, is that they actually assessed and did and had an opportunity for people to self-report on, what was their commitment, or how did, what were their values around inclusion or around equity? And those self-reported values were high. And I think it gets back to what you're saying, that people care, right? But that the threat gets elevated in such a way that they move away. Yeah. And I think that that's an important piece to understand as well. So moving towards, how do we inspire people to move towards these conversations? One part, I think it's also that people need to do their work. Do the work, right? Do the learning, right? If you don't know what the term is, do the reading. Right now that we are in shelter in place, there are so many webinars, right? That are accessible, that we can go back to, podcasts like yours, or trending, and there's just so much information out there. You have to do the work in educating yourself. Secondly is around engaging in cultural humility practice, which is developed by Dr. Melanie Turvalon and Dr. Jan Marie Garcia. So that critical self-reflection and that lifelong learning, recognizing that power differentials are real and that they exist. And I would just say thirdly, another part is actually not having these conversations in a way that doesn't name whiteness. That when we talk about, and I think there's an importance around centering Black voices and centering on this moment, particularly that is targeting Black identified folks in the community and anti-Black racism. But we also need to talk about whiteness. Because we have also reinforced this dynamic where it's either only POC that are being asked and tasked, and I think this is the conversation you wanted to have next, about like being asked and tasked to do the work and educate other people, and all of that additional emotional labor, and that needs to shift as well.
Right. And so when you have an organization, like on the back of the Black Lives Matter movement, I spoke to many agency leaders, and many of them, all of whom I spoke to were white, said that they reached out directly to their Black employees. Some of them reach out to all employees of color to ask them what they need and what they can do. Like, what do you think about that tact? And to me, that seems fair, because you're asking, do you want to step up or do you not, or is that problematic? I'm like, yeah.
Well, I think the query is fair, but there are like so many handouts and toolkits trending around. What is allyship,
Mm-hmm.
And I think the check-in part and seeing people and affirming them is part of allyship, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And I invite people to pair that with an offering.
Mm.
So if I'm going to ask somebody, hey, how are you doing? Knowing that they're likely very impacted, knowing that the answer is that probably they're not okay. How am I going to show up with an offering, right? What would that look like based on my resources, my area of expertise, my positionality in an organization, my power, my privilege? What would it look like to pair that inquiry, right? That I think is an important inquiry, and be ready to actually have an offering.
Yeah. And what could that look like?
Yeah. I think that that's like allyship in action.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is, I think, recognizing in one part, and this, I think this is the other place that you wanted this conversation to go, is around racial trauma and
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that racial trauma is real. And so for many, particularly Black identified folks in this moment, they are showing up when they should be calling out.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody is giving them permission to. Nobody is acknowledging that they're actually moving through the world in grief and trauma and pain, whether it's your colleagues, whether it's also people who might be leaders in your organization. Maybe it's the people that are doing all the work and holding all the space, and maybe doing that in a way that they feel that it's important enough for them to kind of step into that work. But I think that just giving voice and recognition to racial trauma is really important, to be able to recognize that part of that offering is giving people space, giving people permission to take a step back, taking work and load off of people rather than adding more stress. Um, and depending on the parallels of that, that could look different, like in a small team, to be like, hey, this next hot topic project just came in, and I know you were sharing with me about like working in high stress environments. What would it be like to not stress out your colleague when you know that they are probably going through some additional grief and bereavement, right? What would
Right.
it be like to actually think about, oh, maybe let's call in someone else who might be able to have that additional kind of battery reserve in the tank, right? If it is for folks that are in parallel organizations and maybe have a unique skill set and a unique resource, what would it be like to offer that? And a perfect example, in my work, we received a ping from a company that had some access to technology resources, and they were offering, hey, we want to show our solidarity in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
We've got some pro bono hours. Please let us know how we might be able to assist you in your work, right?
Yeah.
And so that resource doesn't always have to be money, right?
Right. Right.
It can look like your area of expertise, your gift, your talent. And I'm going to parallel this right back to COVID-19. And for the listeners in this moment, if you can think back to when you knew that the pandemic was real, and maybe Artie, you could share this with me too, like if you ran around your house looking for all of your extra mini hand sanitizers from conferences, if you were figuring out how to sew up homemade masks, if you were gathering up your Lysol wipes, if you were checking in on your neighbors, if you were supporting people in different ways, if you were making food kits and food baskets, if you were doing something for somebody else with the spirit of love and the spirit of generosity, you mobilize yourself to the best of your ability, right? You didn't need someone to tell you, how could you help?
Yeah.
You stepped up in some way that you know how. And it's with that same love, it's with that same compassion that people need to step up in this moment and
Right.
not see it as being different.
Yes. Yeah. And I think into your point about toolkits, I know you've developed one, a toolkit for allyship, which I will include a link to here in the notes for folks that want to look at that. I want to go back to the D&I officer, because that's something the industry has had that role. So PR agencies in particular many of them have had that role for, I want to say over maybe at least 5 to 7 years, probably longer. I'm actually in the process of trying to figure out when there was the first D&I officer at a PR agency. Obviously that role hasn't been as effective as one would like. The industry, like I said, is still about 89% white. What, so someone from outside the industry, what have you seen is effective, and how does that role need to be positioned in order to actually have the impact that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I want to start by just acknowledging that the challenge is whether if we look at these metrics from our outcome perspectives as representation, as movement in hiring and promotion and advancement, if we look at it from the outcomes of engagement results or belonging reports, we see, right, that there are ongoing disparities. And yet that doesn't mean that work hasn't happened. And I think it's an opportunity to really think, dynamically and critically about it, because I think it is very, very, very complex. So when it comes to, I think, positioning DEI roles in an organization, one part is making sure that those organizations and those teams are well resourced, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they are offices of one or few, and that's just not effective, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having a real seat at leadership tables and decision-making tables,
Mm-hmm.
being valued in that way, I think is deeply important. And I would say a second part is recognizing that that work cannot solely be done and should not solely be done by the DEI team. That actually equity is everybody's responsibility, right? And so every manager, every team group, right? Because even in our organizations, we are often concentrated in our different work teams and our different workspaces, right? With all of the sort of hierarchy and the organizational charts that go with that. So really it's everybody's responsibility. So how do we make sure that equity is part of everybody's work, that we are thinking about it in the ways that we work with one another, and we're thinking about it in the ways in which we are serving, whether that is in your output or your target audience or your users or your engagement.
So in terms of having this be the responsibility of everyone within an organization and not just centered in, around one person, do you think, how do you think that should be done? Should it be part of their performance evaluation? Or is it something that should just be part of the culture and reinforced by leadership as a value?
Yeah, I think as a psychologist, I'm going to say both and. Because there will always need to be, and given that we are working with people, there will always be a human element. And so the interpersonal work, whether that is for individuals around their own learning and growing, will always need to happen. The team-based work of how do people communicate with one another, how do we raise our awareness to our blind spots, to our unconscious biases, is deeply, deeply important. And we also need to examine our policies and our practices to make sure that equity is embedded in our structures and our systems, so that it's not contingent on one individual or an individual doing the good or the right thing in that moment. And I think we see this all the time I think there's a lot of evidence that in sort of the recruiting and HR landscapes, right? Just because some of those processes have so many steps in them, right? And people in their decision-making processes move and enact in ways that may not always really come in an outcome that is their intention in that moment. So I think that both end is really important. And I really think that rooting things in structure and in equity is really powerful. And I think that there's an opportunity to think about the work that's already being done, whether that's different groups, different charges, different task forces, different working teams. How do we make sure that they are pivoting their work to have that equity lens, right?
So I want to go back to, we kind of addressed some of the mental health questions when you spoke about the offering and, dealing with this moment, especially the month of June. I want to broaden that out. So if you are, like I said, PR is a really high stress environment. It's very deadline driven. It's 24 hours. There's client service involved. Beyond this moment where this is top of mind, or like I said, agency leaders are reaching out to their employees, their Black employees, their employees of color. Beyond this moment, how can organizations sustain prioritizing mental health of Black employees, of people of color, in a way that's different than probably what white employees experience? I know the PR industry is known for, this was pre-COVID times, right? They fueled much by alcohol. That was a stress reliever. And as millennials increasingly were not looking to just, drink alcohol every day after work, they were starting to implement things like Pilates classes and, like other forms of wellness, right? Mental health is something that has been quite stigmatized in the industry for a long time. It was only in the last few years that, just crying at your desk or crying in the bathroom was suddenly considered to be unacceptable, it seems. And, agencies are starting to have that conversation about mental health and about stress. So I wanted to kind of take that same conversation and target it specifically around Black employees and around people of color, and what organizations need to be thinking about.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, and I appreciate you kind of starting it by framing sort of this sort of old guard mentality. And in many industries and in many organizations, there is this kind of passing on of really problematic and traumatic ways of doing work, right? Because that's how it's always been done, and we went through it, and so y'all got to go through it too in the same way. And I think that people are learning that we can work better and work in ways that are healthy, right? And just that shift of like everything is not sort of party or extrovert driven, that there's an opportunity to incorporate that piece of wellness. One part around mental health that I think is really important is recognizing that the demonstration, and I started out by talking about racial trauma as being real, but the demonstration of pain and sadness and grief looks very different in different communities. For many communities, regardless of identity, people have been socialized that kind of not showing up and not being okay is not acceptable, and that they're not going to be given a pass. And so even if we look, and especially PRE, all have a great moment around this of humanizing, are protests actually demonstrations of pain? Right? Are those tears in motion? Can we see through anger and sadness, or excuse me, anger and sort of this like expression of that energy? Can we actually read it as pain and as grief? I think that's one part is having more nuanced and having more compassion for the way that is expressed, first and foremost. And secondly is an opportunity for access and recognizing that may look very different for folks. And so the practices of community-based healing and restorative healing is really important. Folks are, in many spaces, are utilizing affinity groups, not just for learning, but also as spaces to promote healing, and doing that in a way that it's not set apart from our work. So creating access, creating opportunity. Many organizations have a tie to mental health through their faculty and staff assistance programs or different resources that are there. And I think the question is, how are those folks that are charged to do that work? How are they anchored and able to meet the needs of in this moment, right, the Black identified community? And if not, how are they partnering and elevating and employing and supporting and creating access to that work that's being done in other spaces, so people can have access to that without having to go get it on their own, right? So one part, if we find ourselves in a space to say, wow, actually our work is really homogenous, or our teams that do wellness are really, really homogenous. We haven't thought about wellness from a culturally congruent way. Okay, now you know. So you get to pivot and you get to learn. And while you're doing that pivoting and while you're doing that learning, create access and invest in that so that folks can get that wellness and that health met and those mental health needs met in the current moment, and not have to sort of figure out how to do that on their own.
Yeah.
So reducing barriers to entry is part of it.
Yeah, and I think as it becomes more clear that COVID-19 in this country anyway is it's with us for the long haul, and it's not a momentary thing. And I think that the mental health situation, and especially as different communities are being impacted in different ways, it's only going to be amplified. I mean, it seems like because the longer we're in this situation, the longer we're isolated. It just seems like we're I don't know if organizations, if companies are prepared for the mental health toll. I mean, especially on communities of color, working parents. I mean, this is getting to be I don't know. It seems like we're going to hit a crisis point on this.
Right. And in such a strange way, there's been such a powerful impact, you know, with COVID-19, but in many industries and organizations, their work has actually expanded exponentially,
Mhm.
right? Um, and I think alongside that, it's important to recognize that yes, we are sort of in this economic crisis in parallel, but we can't continue to do more work with less resources. And so I think we also need to have a reckoning around um, layering on additional stress and additional burden on folks that are already taxed and are already really, really maxed in many different ways. Whether it's like you mentioned, if you didn't know what privilege was, or if you were thinking about power and privilege from a very intellectual space, hopefully COVID-19 has made us all have a human moment around differential lived experiences. Because if your world wasn't shifted in some way, um, I don't know whose wasn't, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And sometimes people are now able to see more, right? To
Mhm.
say, wow, like not only do I have a job, but I have all the tools and the resources to work remotely,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Wow, what might it be like to be an essential worker, even if you're highly employable or highly employed across many different industries, just to have to put yourself in a physical risk every day
Yeah,
by going into spaces. So
yeah.
I think it's really powerful.
Right. No, I think the point about privilege, if people didn't understand it going before the crisis, I mean, gosh, like, um, so LaMisha, this was a great conversation. Is there any final words that, anything I didn't ask about that you want to mention?
Let me think about that. We used to ask this question on the podcast. Our question was, "Are there any elephants that you would like to name?"
Ah, I
In
like that.
that
I like
spirit, but I like the closing words, and I think I just want to emphasize to the people that are listening is um, that we. Well, I would say there's one thing that I didn't name, and that is that race is not real. And so if you are still stuck on being set apart from people based on how they look, it is not real.
it.
The impact on race and the differences that it has on health, outcome, life, and livelihood is very real, and we need to honor that. But we are not set apart from one another. And so, just to kind of hit home again, the same energy that you stepped up in with the COVID-19 pandemic, apply that same love and compassion to this moment, so that as a collective consciousness, we can, right, really move through this. And I think that that's my hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us, LaMisha.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks for all the amazing work that you and Provoke are doing. So appreciate your voice in this work as well.
Thank you. And folks, we'll be back again in a few weeks with another episode.